Yes, well, thank you for inviting me to talk about this. This is an issue very close to my heart. Before I start, I just wanted to reiterate why I think this is so important. I was at an SMR Congress a few years ago, and a former colleague of mine, Lorna Waters, who is the head of Global Insights at Reckitt Benckiser, put a chart extremely similar to this up on the screen, and she had a build similar to this. And the build, as you can see, shows that this is a summary of a quarterly report, and the summary was 278 pages. As Lorna pointed out, she could actually run a marathon faster than she could physically read the summary. And yet it was a summary, and yet this was a quarterly report. She had another example, which is another quite scary example of a presentation in which it was very, very, very long, and there was an awful lot of chart after chart after chart after chart, mostly questions just charted up. And she asked the company who'd done the research to go back and make it a lot shorter. And she found that what they did was they just put 4 charts on each slide. So yes, obviously they cut it by a massive amount, but fundamentally it was still exactly the same presentation. So as a result, this issue means that research doesn't actually help people in terms of driving decisions or helping organizations make change. And this is actually the most important issue for client-side researchers. I think there was some recent survey in Green Book which showed that the lack of action taken or the lack of implementation of research was the most important issue for client-side researchers. And for me, the communication of the research is the reason that so much of it is not used. Now, I'm not a researcher. I have actually worked in the research industry for nearly 15 years now. But I'm a communications person, and my background's in branding and journalism. So whenever I talk about this to researchers, I do feel a little like I'm walking into a lion's den, because I feel that researchers probably know much more about it than I do, specifically in terms of the research content. But I think what we can look at and what I can bring is a slight external perspective on the industry and how it communicates. Looking at the big, huge communication revolution that we're currently experiencing, and we're all experiencing, we're all living through. Looking a little bit at how journalists and data journalists work and how we might perhaps learn from that. And then I'm going to cover 5 things I think researchers can do, and these are observations of mine, to ensure that they can communicate better. So, so that's the agenda. And first of all, yes, the communication revolution. We are living through the biggest, I mean, I think it has to be called the 3rd revolution. We might have had the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, and this has to be the communications revolution. It's mostly because of the internet, but it's also because of the entire whole way that digital space is taking over our lives. And as human beings, we are changing as a result. We expect to be entertained. We expect everything to be accessible and intuitive and easy. We want to behave like, it sort of brings out the inner 3-year-old in us, if you like. And that is the environment we are all living and working in. We don't leave our inner 3-year-old behind when we arrive at the office. Our inner 3-year-old is still there with us the whole time. At the same time, there's an awful lot of evidence coming out, and it has been coming out for some time, that actually the way that the internet works and the way that we use it is making us less intelligent. It's making us less able to use our brains to do our own thinking. It's providing things in a fast and instant, digestible fashion, which means that we have to make less intellectual effort in order to achieve things. So it's possible that actually the internet could be making things worse, and this communications revolution could be making things worse. In addition, as human beings, we are specifically designed to filter information. We are specifically designed to limit what we take in. And that goes back for millennia, and there's huge amounts of evidence of this. We become extremely stressed when we're asked to take in vast quantities of information, and we are adept and sophisticated at filtering what we take in, and that's how our brains work. And in the midst of all this, as part of this communication revolution, we are presented with tools from an organization like Microsoft, which enable us to do all sorts of things ourselves. And this is a truly hideous slide, intentionally hideous in case somebody thought it wasn't, which shows what an absolute mess of things you can make using a combination of Excel and PowerPoint and 3D imagery, etc., etc. And I don't think anybody can do a presentation about the market research industry without actually referring to PowerPoint, which is the preferred tool of communication within the industry. And it's very strongly my view that it's not the fault of PowerPoint that you get slides like this. It's very much the person driving the PowerPoint. So I'm going to come back to how we might be able to help this situation. And one result of the rise of this communication revolution, and this rise of communicating imagery, is software that enables us to create extremely powerful and seductive imagery at the touch of a button. This is an example of a winner at the IIEX Awards, the DIVA Awards, which is actually for data visualization. And this is a piece of software which turns out the most stunning mapping of Twitter, the Twitter sphere, in terms of what happens over particular stories and the spread of particular stories on Twitter. And you can see the little nodes making these wonderful connections everywhere, but clearly very different maps, and we can read these and we can work out how to communicate. But the point is that this is something very beautifully done, really with very little human intervention. I mean, the software is written by the human, but the design isn't done. And these types of seductive images are becoming hugely popular. They're visible everywhere. They're how we now digest information. And on the whole, an awful lot of them are not being produced by market researchers. They're being produced by data journalists and software engineers. I went to a lecture recently in which I discovered that huge amounts of articles are actually being driven by algorithms. So they don't require journalists to actually write the news story. An algorithm will write the news story. And in fact, the front page story in the Los Angeles Times a few weeks ago was generated by a robot, which is basically an algorithm which assesses information about earthquakes. So this is happening to us all the time, and I think it's very interesting looking at the way these people work. When I was researching this, I read quite a lot by a guy called Nicola Lorenz, who's a data journalist, and he described the process that data journalists go through in order to create a story. And they gather all the data and they filter that data, so they do analysis and think about what's important, and then they visualize it, and then out of that they develop the story. And I felt that was a very different. Researchers really work differently. They would certainly get the data and they would certainly filter it, but with many researchers you probably end after the filtering point. If you were lucky, you would get that filter told in a story, which is very important, clearly, and then after that they might think about making the story look pretty and visualizing it. And I just felt that it was something we could perhaps learn from as researchers, thinking about how data journalists visualize in order to create this story. And I want to add a story of my own here, which is from a few years ago when I was organizing an international market research conference. And I invited a journalist to come and talk to the conference about his experience and understanding of the similarities and differences between journalism and research. And he told this story, which he called Gorillas in Our Midst. And as a start point for his presentation, he used the very well-known experiment done at Columbia University in the 70s, in which psychology researchers made a film of people playing basketball, and in the middle of the film they got someone to come on in a gorilla suit and join in the game, and they played this film to two identical groups of students, and one group of students were told just to watch the film, and afterwards they were going to be asked about what they'd seen. The other group of students was told to count the number of passes that were made during the game. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the group of students who had to count the number of passes that were being made during the game did not spot the gorilla coming in and joining in. And in fact, I think something like 70% of students failed to spot the gorilla. And this famous story clearly has a very powerful analogy for market researchers, as we're very, very involved and engrossed even in looking at data and thinking about the data, and we fail to stand back from the data sometimes and see what the real story is. And Alan, the journalist who I commissioned for this piece, gave an example of his own gorilla, which was he was preparing a story about Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was launching a lemon variant, and he had done a huge amount of research into Coca-Cola and the company and what they were doing. And while doing this research, which was piling up on his desk, he noticed that in 2004, which is when he was preparing the story, that actually the growth of Walmart in that year had been the equivalent of an entire Coca-Cola company's sales. So Walmart was growing each year at that point by the size of the whole Coca-Cola company. And he clearly suddenly realized that the story wasn't about a lemon variant or a cherry variant for Coca-Cola. The story was about Walmart and their channel to market and the amazing growth and control, perhaps, of that particular channel. And so this was the slide that he showed to illustrate his own gorilla. So taking all that on board, clearly, as a journalist, if you don't have a story, you don't have a point, and it's exactly the same for research. And when I say story, what I mean is something that you can tell somebody in simple words, in a straightforward language. You know, if you like, it's the story, it's the elevator pitch, it's the summary of what you're doing. If you can't do that after a study, if you can't say what the most important thing was, or how it works, or how it fits in with the organisation, then I think that there's not much point in doing the research. And in terms of developing the story, a very key element which I find, which I think if you look back to the way that data journalists work, is the fact that actually the process of doing research, of gathering research and of understanding, which is something that researchers are extremely good at, is not the same as the process of communicating. It uses a different part of the brain, it requires a different thought process, and actually the way that most researchers do their communication is effectively they consider it the end point of the process of understanding. And actually it should be the beginning point of the process of communicating. And I think that researchers need to think about it in a different way in terms of how they approach their communications. So, excuse me. So, over the last 15 years, I've observed researchers doing all sorts of communication, and I've tried to come up with 5 things that I think are things that you can do which will help ensure that research is communicated better and that has impact. And the first one is to really know your audience and target it appropriately to your audience. So here are 4 different types of audience for market research. And these are 4 very, very different individuals. They probably have very different needs, and they probably think differently. And actually, every single time you do a piece of communication, you need to understand who is receiving it and how they like to receive it and what they're looking for in it. And you need to tailor it as much as possible and make it appropriate for these different audiences. Even if you're doing a study in a particular area, I mean, you might work exclusively in automotive and you might work exclusively in finance. Even if you do that, you need to understand the different organizations that you're talking to. Here are 3 car companies. You might think, oh yes, it's an automotive presentation, but these companies will absolutely, without a shadow of doubt, have very different ways of communicating internally, have different requests and requirements for how they disseminate data and communicate internally, and you really, really need to understand that and take that on board when you're thinking about communicating with them. So here's an example. I've used this before, but I do think that Join the Dots, which has won the Aura Award for communications and research at least twice, I think they're very, very good at this. And here's an example of one study they did, which was to a local authority, some research for a local authority in the north of the UK. And they did one presentation, which was for their direct client, which was the research team within this local authority. And they wanted the number, and they wanted the stats, and they did a very straightforward presentation, which looks extremely familiar to nearly all of us, with the, with charts, with numbers on it, basically demonstrating what the data was. And that audience very much needed that data. But at the same time, they also had to present the research to local politicians. And these politicians did not have the time or the inclination to really understand the data or to see the story through the data. So they did exactly the same presentation, only this time my advanced key is not working. Ah, gone too far. Right, only this, sorry, my keyboard appears to have frozen. Only this time they did the same presentation with no data, no charts, and entirely in pictures to tell the story for the politicians. And this was phenomenally successful, and the politicians really got the point and didn't get lost and stuck in the different data. So I think that's a really, really good example of understanding the audience that you're speaking to and making sure that you communicate appropriately. The second thing is about sticking to the story and making sure that you are very focused and you delete everything else to avoid ambiguity. We have enormous amounts of ambiguity that creep in research, and I often think that researchers find it very hard to be really cruel with their data and only include the data that they really believe that supports the story. When you're thinking about segmentations, which we quite often come across, a description of a typical segment, for example, this person is a family man, he's in his 60s, but he has slightly alternative views, and it could be either of these people described very well in that description verbally. So we have to be really, really clear whether we're talking about Prince Charles or Ozzy Osbourne. And so to be absolutely certain to avoid ambiguity, I would say, is extremely important. And one little story which I like to use about this is the story of Michelangelo when asked, faced with a large piece of marble, and he was asked by somebody what he was going to make it into, and Michelangelo said he was going to make it into a lion. And the question was, well, how are you going to do that? And Michelangelo said he was going to knock off all the pieces that didn't look like a lion. And I think that having that vision and having that sense of focus is exactly what researchers need to have when they're thinking about their communications, focusing on the story. And here's one example of how I've done this in the past. Working on a project with Ogilvy, we did some research for large organizations, for the Vodafones and Fords of this world, thinking how they can target small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, and how best to approach this audience. So we did research amongst SMEs, trying to understand them better and what their needs are from big organizations. And we came up with this story, Are You Talking to SME?, which is obviously appropriate for the large organizations who are targeting SMEs, because it's very obvious, yes, I'm talking to SMEs, how do I do that? But it's also a line from a movie called Taxi Driver, in which Robert De Niro, who is the eponymous hero, is talking to himself in a mirror, and he's describing, he sees himself as a one man against the world, he's totally being picked on, and he talks to himself in the mirror and says, are you talking to me? And anybody who's seen that film who understands that will understand immediately that that's exactly how the small business owners felt when they were being treated by the big organizations. They felt the big organizations were bullying them and were singling them out and making their lives extremely difficult. So that was the concept of the story, so it worked in both ways. And we articulated that story in the same way across a presentation, a booklet for people who couldn't actually see a presentation and really wanted to read, We communicated it on HTML emails, which described the different segments of SMEs and gave links, which went through to a microsite where we had vox pops and videos as well as more data stored. So we created all that, thinking about all the different audiences, but making sure that every single point of the way we had exactly the same, are you talking to SMEs still coming across? And that was very, very important and very effective. So the third thing which I think researchers can do is I think they need to think more about working like communication agencies and the way the communication agencies approach projects, because actually the communication of your research is effectively the same as a communication project for an agency. And in order to do that, I think that they should use a brief. In a communication agency, you never do a piece of creative work unless you've got a creative brief. And that creative brief will have honed right down everything you need to know, and it will have a one single key overriding statement which is agreed that you're trying to communicate, which is effectively a summation of the story. And you don't do anything without that, and you don't do anything that doesn't meet that brief. So without that creative brief, you don't get a new visual identity, which is, you know, an example here. And I think it's extremely important to think about how communications agencies work. I mean, this is an example of a poster which is a huge amount of data, enormous amount of detail have gone into it, but there's one single overriding message which is very, very powerfully communicated. And then the fourth thing, and this is something that researchers really struggle with, and I often get questions about this, so I'd be very happy to field them at the end if you've got them, is managing time. It's something that communications is something that researchers never leave enough time for. They never give enough thought to it. It's always because the data takes so long to get in on a project, you're struggling to pull everything together. You nearly always find that people are charting up huge amounts of data which probably doesn't need to be charted up. And then they've got a massive deadline, the client wants it earlier, the client wants to see initial results before the project's really finished, etc., etc. And that's all to do with researchers being able to be confident, to push back with clients, to charge more money where necessary, and to actually ensure that they consult and add value rather than act like suppliers. So I think managing time is absolutely important, and ensuring you build enough time to communicate properly is really key. And finally, there's a huge amount of professional help out there, and researchers often feel that they should be able to do everything themselves, and quite often I think they're too nervous to approach photographers or filmmakers or designers to help them on projects. I think this is changing. A lot of agencies are getting designers on board and engaging people who are actually trained to think about how to communicate. But I think that far too many researchers are too nervous to do this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be hugely expensive, and it can add enormous amounts of value. And I think that's something that researchers could do much more. So those are my 5 things. Think about your audience and target. Always completely stick to the story and delete anything else. That's what an appendix is for. Use a brief wherever possible. So think about your communication of your project as a communication project. Think about how you're going to communicate. Manage it with your time really, really carefully. Get help when you need it. And above all, make sure that you spot the gorilla.